Next, we take a look at the observer pattern. And as we saw before, with model view controller, model view controller is sort of a specific version of the observer pattern. As before, you should be able to get the observer pattern Wikipedia page. Somehow I'm not able to pull it up right now, so let's skip that. Alright, so what happens in the observer pattern is that it's like a simplification of the model view controller. So in model view controller, we know that the model notifies one or more views when something interesting happens. So for example, a button or JButton object, when it's clicked, notifies action listeners when something interesting happens, that is when the button is clicked. Views in turn attach themselves to some model in order to be notified, and action listeners are like that. They attach themselves to a button in order to be notified. So we can generalize this structure of a model and a view by having observers attach themselves to an observable or subject. So that's the basic idea. So for example, let's say we have a stock quote service. So there's an observable which is real-time market data feed, and this information or this data from the observable goes out to many observers. So the intent is to define a one-to-many dependency between objects, so that when one object changes, that is the observable changes state, all its dependent objects are notified. So once again, the observable changes, a whole bunch of observers are notified of this change, and they take some action. So it's just like the JButton notifying action listeners. So these action listeners register with the button, and when something happens, all the action listeners that are registered are notified by the button. Same way, observable has a whole bunch of observers that are registered with this observable, and when something happens, they're all notified. Okay, so the key forces that in this pattern is that there may be many observers and just one observable. And of course, observers can observe usually more than one observable, but let's just take one observable. Each observer may react differently to the same notification. So if you click on a button, for example, there might be many things that act as button listeners, and they can do anything they want in their action performed method. The observables should be decoupled from the observers to allow them to change independently. So that's just good design, to decouple the observable or the model from the observers, the view. So observers should be able to query the observable for required information. So all they should know is that something has changed, and then usually what happens is they send a method to the observable for more information about what has changed. So the context for the observer pattern is that there is an object called the subject or observable, which is the source of events. One or more observer objects want to be notified when such an event occurs. So that's the basic structure. How do you solve that requirement, or this specification that you should have to have a subject, source of the events, and then one or more observers want to be notified when something happens? The way this is done is to define an observer interface type, and all concrete observers implement this abstract interface type. The subject or observable maintains a collection of observers, that is, observers register themselves with the subject or observable. The subject supplies methods for attaching and detaching observers, so that's how you register yourself. So attaching just means an observer says I want to be notified. So it's when in terms of JButtons, this is like say calling the add action listener method. So all of these observers call the add action listener method, and so these are all added to the as listeners of the observable. So that's attaching the add action listeners like attaching. Detaching is remove action listeners. Whenever an event occurs, the subject notifies all observers. So that's easy to do because a whole bunch of action listeners will have attached themselves or added themselves as listeners to a single, let's say, JButton object, or in this case, a stock quote service. This is just it can be a list of observers that the observable keeps track of. Okay. Basic structure or class diagram would be, let's say you could have either a class or an interface for an abstract subject, and then either a class or an interface. In Java, I guess it makes sense to make this an interface. The subject has an attach method that an observer can call to attach itself to the subject. Any number of observers can call the attach method to have a list of things that this subject or observable knows about and will notify. And how does that happen? So the subject just sits in a loop and calls the notify method of each thing that has attached itself. So if you want to abstract out the details, you want to make this an interface. This is all completely abstract methods. Notify has no method body. It's implemented in some concrete observer. So something that will respond to, for example, button clicks. Let's assume that a concrete subject would be something like a JButton, and the observer is an action listener interface. And concrete observer is any class that implements action listener. So like a button, something that's listening for button events. The attach is, as we talked about before, is like calling the add action listener. So each button will have an add action listener method. You call that and say that this object, some object that's an instance of a class that implements action listener, will be one of the listeners for this JButton. And notify is just like action performed. So when someone clicks on the button, it says, all right, who are all the action listeners? I have a list of them. I'm going to call the notify method of each one. So action listeners, notify method is basically like action performed. Okay, so the structure of the design pattern, once again, usually you have an abstract class with a more concrete subject. For example, the JButton would be an example of a concrete subject. And you may not need things like get state and subject states. That this would be get and set subject state methods to change the state of the subject or just get it. The observer is notified. So the observer is just an interface which has a notify or update method. It's the same thing. So it's slightly different notation. Usually we use notify. Some people talk about instead of notify, it's called the update method. That's actually what Java uses. Okay. And here is how calls are made in terms of a sequence diagram. The concrete subject is something like a JButton. And let's say in this case there's two observers or two classes that implement the action listener interface. So one of these might actually set the state, and then something happens, and then it calls the update method of all of the observers. So it'll call, let's say, the update method of this object, and then update method of this object. In return, you might do something like get state. For example, if you're talking about mouse listeners or something, you might want to get the X and Y coordinates. That would be part of the state of something that listens for mouse coordinates. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Once again, the basic design pattern can be described as having, let's say, one class and an interface and a concrete observer. But what we will do next is we'll set this up with as an abstract interface, and then have a concrete subject. The concrete subject would be something like a J button. So that's how it's done. This is sort of a abbreviated class diagram, and then we'll take a look at how we can. I'm hoping that most of you are familiar with how JButton works, that this diagram sort of makes sense. Just think of the attach as add action listener, the notify as action performed. I think that's the key to understanding how this applies to a JButton. Okay.